Hey everybody, and welcome to your lesson that's about classifying organisms into what's called domains and kingdoms. So people naturally put objects into groups based on their similarities and their differences. Scientists have done this to classify organisms based on their characteristics. This is called taxonomy. Now, in taxonomy, we have certain categories. We place organisms into these categories based on what characteristics they have. Groups that are similar belong in the same category. Groups can get more specific as you go down. The largest group that any organism will be in is called its domain. From there, each domain is broken up into smaller pieces called a kingdom. Each kingdom is broken up into different phylums. Phylums are broken up into classes. Classes are broken up into orders. Orders are broken up into families. Families are broken up into genuses. And then from there, you can find the specific species of the organism. Let's think about this in terms of a grocery store. How do we classify things in a grocery store? Well, you might say that there are three main types of foods. We're going to call these the domains. This is just an example. So remember, each domain is a bread or a meat or a produce. Remember, this is just an example. These are not really the domains. We're just making a comparison. So if we were to talk about the three domains, there would be specific characteristics that each organism would have to meet in order to be classified in one of these three groups. So if it's made of a grain, it'll be a bread. If it's meat from an animal, it'll be in the meat group. Or if it grows out of the ground, it'll be a produce. So let's talk about this in terms of classifying organisms based on their characteristics. If it belongs in the domain bacteria, it will be a prokaryotic organism that is unicellular. If the organism belongs in the domain archaea, it'll be similar to bacteria, meaning it'll be prokaryotic and unicellular, but it'll also grow in an extremely harsh environment. Now, if the organism belongs in the group eukarya, it'll be a eukaryotic organism. It'll be unicellular or multicellular. All of these organisms are going to have membrane-bound nucleuses. Okay? So let's take a look at this in terms of a flow chart. So first we have to ask ourselves, is the organism that we're looking at, does it have a nucleus? If the answer is yes, we automatically know that it's in the group Eukarya. But if the answer is no, we don't know if it's bacteria or archaea. So then we have to ask ourselves another question. Does this organism grow in a harsh environment? If the answer is no, then it's a bacteria. But if the answer is yes, then it's an archaea. So we just have to look at these series of questions to classify an organism into its correct group or into its correct domain. Now let's relate this back to our grocery store example. If we know that an organism is made out of a grain, we know that it's going to be in the bread kingdom. Or if we know that it is some type of animal, we know that it's going to be in the meat kingdom. If it grows out of the ground, it'll be in either the apple, broccoli, orange, or leafy green kingdom. Again, this is just an example so you can understand how we take a broad group of things and break it down into kingdoms. Let's relate this back, though, to our specific organisms and their cell types to figure out how we classify an organism into its correct kingdom. Okay, so we're starting with bacteria. If it's in the domain bacteria, it's going to be in the kingdom bacteria. That one's easy. Everything in the kingdom bacteria is prokaryotic, unicellular, autotrophic or heterotrophic, or has asexual reproduction. These things can cause sickness. Now, similarly to bacteria, the kingdom Archaea is prokaryotic, it's unicellular, it can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, it's asexual in reproduction, and it exists in extreme environments. Okay, so if it's in the domain bacteria, it belongs in the kingdom bacteria. If it's in the domain Archaea, it belongs in the kingdom Archaea. Those two are easy. But now let's look at the domain Eukarya and divide those organisms into 4 different kingdoms, starting with the kingdom Protista. Protista is eukaryotic, mostly unicellular, but some can be simple multicellular organisms. Then they can be autotrophic or they could be heterotrophic. They could also be sexual and or asexual in reproduction. Some examples of these are amoebas and molds. Now, organisms from the domain Eukarya could also be classified in the kingdom fungi. These are all eukaryotic because they're in the domain Eukarya, and they're mostly multicellular, but some of them can be unicellular. Every organism in the kingdom fungi is heterotrophic, meaning it receives nutrients from the decomposing organic matter around it. Examples of these are mushrooms and yeast. All right, now moving on to the kingdom Plantae. Every one of these are eukaryotic because they're in the domain Eukarya. They're all multicellular, so they all have cell walls and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Every one of these organisms is autotrophic. They all use photosynthesis to create their own food. Then they could be either sexual or asexual in reproduction. Finally, in the domain Eukarya, we have the kingdom Animalia. They are all eukaryotic organisms. They're multicellular, so they do not have cell walls or chloroplasts, right? Because those are the things that are plants. Animals do not have cell walls or chloroplasts. They're all heterotrophic, meaning we have to eat our own food. And all animals have sexual reproduction. So, what does this look like when we break things down? Remember, any organism that's in the domain bacteria is in the kingdom bacteria. Any organism that is in the domain Archaea is in the kingdom Archaea. And then Eukarya is divided into 4 different kingdoms: the protists, the fungi, the plantae, and the animalia. So what does this look like in terms of a flowchart? Remember, we first start with domains. Does it have a nucleus or does it not? If it does, we know that it's in the domain Eukarya. If it doesn't, we have to ask ourselves another question. Does it grow in a harsh environment? If it does not, then it's a bacteria. But if it does, it's an Archaea. Now, to classify organisms in the domain Eukarya, we have to ask ourselves, is it multicellular? If it's not, we know it's a protist. But if it is, we have to ask more questions. Is it autotrophic? If yes, we know we have a plant. But if no, meaning it's heterotrophic, we then have to ask another question. Does it reproduce asexually? If yes, it's a fungi. If no, then we have animalia or fungi. Now, from here, we have to ask ourselves a little bit more questions about what the cell looks like. Now, you'll learn more about this when you get to 7th grade, and then again in high school biology. But from here, we would have to determine what the cell wall is. Does it have a cell wall? If yes, then it's a fungi. If no, then it's an animalia. You don't have to know very much about cell walls here in 6th grade. You just need to know how to get to this point, okay? And then in 7th grade, you'll learn more about the cell walls. All right. Now, finally, here are all of the characteristics for each of the kingdoms. I recommend that you try to commit this to memory as possible, or have this open and use it as a reference as you go through your lesson. This will be extremely beneficial for you. Thank you.